There comes a moment in life when you realize that the people you love are capable of hurting you in ways you never imagined possible. For me, that moment happened at a family dinner, when my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, opened her mouth and destroyed what remained of my dignity in front of everyone. She laughed, that loud, cruel laugh, and told everyone that I was broke, that I didn't even have enough money to buy groceries at the supermarket. Her words echoed through the dining room as the other guests began to whisper and giggle, looking at me with that mixture of pity and contempt. I stood there, paralyzed, feeling my face burn with humiliation, while my son, David, my only child, looked away and pretended not to see anything. In that moment, something inside me broke. But what no one in that room knew, what Rebecca and my own family were completely unaware of, was that a week later, her boss would announce a $10 million donation to the organization where she worked. And when she discovered where that money came from, when she finally understood who the anonymous donor was, that smug smile would disappear from her face forever. What happened after that revelation changed not only my family dynamics, but completely transformed how I saw myself and my true worth. This is the story of how I went from being the ridiculed and despised mother-in-law to the woman who finally reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her power. If you've made it this far, you probably know that family relationships can be incredibly complex and painful, right? Here on this channel, you'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are shared without judgment. These stories will move you, make you reflect, and perhaps even help you better understand your own experiences with the people you love. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community where every story matters, where you're never alone in your pain, and where there's always hope for a new beginning. Now, let me tell you from the beginning how it all began and how I ended up at that fateful dinner. My name is Margaret, I'm 62 years old, and for a long time, I believed that being a good mother and mother-in-law meant completely denying myself. When David met Rebecca 8 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. My son deserved happiness after a difficult divorce that left him emotionally and financially devastated. Rebecca was beautiful, articulate, worked at a prominent non-profit, and seemed to genuinely care about David. I strived to have a good relationship with her from day one. I invited them both to dinner every week, always asked about her work, complimented her choices, and tried to be the mother-in-law every daughter-in-law wishes she had. But from the beginning, there was something in her eyes when she looked at me. A coldness I tried to ignore, a silent judgment I pretended not to notice. Soon after their wedding, they bought a house in a nice neighborhood outside of Seattle. It was a beautiful home, but it needed some work. Rebecca casually mentioned over lunch that they were financially strapped because of the down payment and would have to postpone the necessary renovations. I didn't hesitate. I offered to help with $15,000 for the most urgent renovations. David was hesitant, saying it was a lot of money, but Rebecca quickly accepted, saying it would be a loan and that they would pay me back as soon as their financial situation improved. I told them it didn't have to be a loan, that it was a gift, and that I wanted to help. The money came from a small portion of my savings, something I could afford without compromising my financial security. They never knew it, but I had far more resources than I let on. My late husband, Thomas, had been an exceptional investor. During our 35 years of marriage, he built a portfolio that grew beyond anyone's wildest dreams. When he passed away 10 years ago, he left me very well provided for. But Thomas always said that money should be handled discreetly, that ostentation was a sign of insecurity. So I maintained my simple lifestyle. I lived in the same modest home where we raised David, drove the same car for years, and bought my clothes at ordinary department stores. I had wealthy friends and served on the boards of philanthropic organizations, but always discreetly. No one, not even David, had any real idea of the size of the fortune Thomas had left me. After the house renovations, other requests came in. Rebecca mentioned they needed new furniture because the ones they had were old and didn't match the renovated house. I paid for a sofa and a dining table. Then came a used car for Rebecca because hers was giving her trouble. Then came a vacation they couldn't afford but desperately needed to relax from the stress of work. Then came help with Rebecca's sister's wedding costs because her family was struggling. I always said yes. I always found a way to help. And always, they promised it was temporary, that they would soon be in a better financial situation, and that they would compensate me in some way. But as the months turned into years, something changed. Rebecca's initial gratitude was gradually replaced by an attitude of entitlement. She stopped thanking me for financial help. In fact, she began asking more and more directly, sometimes even with a hint of impatience when I hesitated. Worse, she began making subtle comments about my life choices. She'd comment on how small and outdated my house was. She'd make observations about my clothes, always with that tone of someone trying to be helpful but actually criticizing. She'd ask why I didn't travel more, why I didn't enjoy life more, why I was so attached to old things. David never intervened in these situations. My son, who had always been a kind but weak-willed man, simply stayed quiet when Rebecca belittled me. Sometimes I'd catch an uncomfortable look from him, but he never said anything. He never defended me. He never asked her to stop. And that hurt more than anything Rebecca could have said. Seeing my own son choose silence when his wife disrespected me was a pain I didn't know how to process. Things got worse when Rebecca got pregnant. Suddenly, I wasn't just the mother-in-law with money who could be helpful. I was the grandmother who needed to know her place. Rebecca had very strong opinions about everything related to pregnancy and the baby to come. And whenever I tried to offer advice based on my own experience of motherhood, she would rudely cut me off. She would say things were different now, that I was out of touch, that the methods I'd used with David were outdated and even harmful. I tried to laugh and say yes, things had changed, but inside, I felt completely devalued. When my granddaughter Emily was born 3 years ago, I thought things would get better. I imagined having a baby would bring us all closer, that Rebecca would see me as an ally, not a threat. But the exact opposite happened. Rebecca controlled every aspect of my access to Emily. I had to ask permission to visit. I had to follow an endless list of rules when I was with the baby. I couldn't give Emily any gifts without Rebecca's prior approval. I couldn't post photos of my granddaughter on social media. I couldn't have Emily in my home unsupervised. It was as if I were a dangerous stranger, not the child's grandmother. And even with all these restrictions and treatment, I continued to help financially. I paid for Emily's full nursery. I bought Rebecca the expensive stroller she wanted. I financed the baby music lessons that cost a fortune. I covered the babysitter's expenses when Rebecca returned to work. Every time they needed money, I was there. And every time I gave money, a small part of me died a little more, because I knew I wasn't buying love or respect. I was just perpetuating a cycle where I was useful but not valued. The worst part was that Rebecca started making comments about my financial situation to others. At family gatherings, she would casually mention that I was helping them because I didn't have much else to do with my money, since I lived such a simple and dull life. She told her friends that I was one of those older ladies who lived frugally because they were from a different generation. She painted a picture of me as a lonely, somewhat pathetic woman who clung to her family because she had nothing else in life. And the worst part was that people believed this narrative. I saw that mixture of pity and discomfort in others' eyes when Rebecca spoke of me this way. There were times when I wanted to shout the truth. He meant that I wasn't some poor soul living on scraps. That I had more money than Rebecca could earn in several lifetimes. That I chose to live simply because I had different values than hers. But something always held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the upbringing I received to never use money as a weapon. Or maybe it was just fear that even knowing the truth, they wouldn't change how they treated me. Things reached a critical point 6 months ago. Rebecca got a major promotion at the organization where she worked, a large non-profit foundation focused on early childhood education. She was ecstatic and decided to host a celebratory dinner at home to celebrate with friends and family. I, of course, was invited. In fact, Rebecca made it clear that she expected me to help with the dinner's costs, as it would be a significant event for her career. Once again, I said yes. I paid for the buffet, the drinks, and the decorations. Altogether, it came to almost $3,000. On the night of the dinner, I arrived early to help with the final preparations. Rebecca greeted me at the door, and I could immediately tell she was stressed. She began ordering me around abruptly, treating me more like a hired help than the mother-in-law who had paid for it all. I swallowed my pride and did as she asked. I organized the drinks, arranged the cushions on the sofa, and arranged the snacks on pretty trays. When the guests began arriving, Rebecca didn't even introduce me to her co-workers. I stood there, serving drinks, feeling invisible. The dinner itself was elaborate and delicious. Everyone was in good spirits, celebrating Rebecca's promotion. She was radiant, wearing an expensive new dress, and receiving congratulations from all around. At one point, someone asked about Rebecca's family, and she started talking about how lucky she was to have David, about how Emily was the most beautiful and intelligent child in the world. She didn't even mention my name. It was as if I didn't exist. After dinner, everyone moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. I was in the kitchen washing some dishes when I heard Rebecca laughing loudly in the living room. Curious about what was so funny, I approached the door. What I heard froze me in place. One of Rebecca's friends was asking about me, apparently having noticed me there but not being introduced. And it was then that Rebecca said those words I'll never forget. She's broke, doesn't even have enough money to buy groceries. We kind of take care of her now. She stays around helping out because she honestly has nothing else to do. It's kind of sad actually, but what can we do, right? She's David's mom. The room fell silent for a moment before someone quickly changed the subject. But the damage was done. I stood there in the kitchen, clutching a dish towel, feeling my world crumble. All those times I'd helped, all those thousands of dollars I'd given, all those occasions when I'd put their needs above my own, and that was how she saw me. As a pauper. As a burden. As someone who needed their charity. I waited in the kitchen until I could control the tears that threatened to fall. Then, silently, I grabbed my bag and left through the back door. No one noticed my departure. No one looked for me. I drove home in shock, my mind racing over what had just happened. When I got home, I sat on the old sofa Thomas and I had bought decades ago and let the tears finally fall. I cried for the humiliation, for the injustice, for all the years I had allowed myself to be treated as less than I was. But amid the tears, something else began to build inside me. A cold, calculated rage. A determination that this couldn't continue. I'd spent years accepting emotional scraps while throwing financial parties. I'd allowed myself to be diminished and devalued by people who had no idea who I really was. And in that moment, sitting alone in my living room, I decided it was time for a change. In the days following the dinner, no one contacted me. David didn't call to ask why I'd left early. Rebecca didn't text me to thank me for the money I'd spent on her dinner. It was as if I really was as irrelevant as she'd suggested to her friends. And the longer the silence stretched, the more my resolve grew. I began to think about how I'd lived these past few years. Always available, always saying yes, always trying to buy affection through financial generosity. And what had this brought me? Disrespect. Humiliation. The constant feeling of not being good enough. I had become a lesser version of myself, hiding who I truly was, living in fear that if I didn't keep giving money, I would completely lose access to my son and granddaughter. It was then that I had an idea. Rebecca worked for the Northwest Educational Foundation, a reputable organization that did important work providing educational resources to children in underserved communities. I knew the organization well. In fact, I had served anonymously on its advisory board for 3 years. They were in the midst of a major fundraising campaign, trying to raise $20 million to expand their programs. And I, through my connections and resources, was in a position to make a significant difference in that campaign. 4 years, I had donated to various causes, always anonymously. It was just as Thomas had taught me. You donate because you want to make a difference, not because you want recognition. But this time, I decided to do things a little differently. I would make a significant donation to the Northwest Educational Foundation. But the anonymity would only be temporary. Eventually, Rebecca would discover who the donor was. And when she did, It would be at a time and in a way that I carefully orchestrated. I contacted the foundation's executive director, a man named Robert Chen, whom I'd known for years through my philanthropic work. I scheduled a meeting in his office to discuss a donation. When I sat down in front of him and told him I wanted to donate $10 million to the campaign, his eyes widened. It was a massive amount, more than any individual donation they'd received in their 30-year history. Robert wanted to announce the donation immediately, put my name on plaques and programs, and give me all sorts of public recognition. But I said no. I explained that I wanted the donation to be anonymous initially, but that in a few weeks, I would allow my name to be revealed under specific circumstances that I would still define. Robert was confused by this unusual request, but when someone is offering $10 million, they tend to be flexible with the terms. Over the next few weeks, I finalized all the details of the donation. The money was transferred. Robert agreed to make a special announcement at the Foundation's all-hands meeting 3 weeks later. He would announce that they had received a transformative $10 million gift from an anonymous donor, but he wouldn't reveal my name yet. He agreed that, when the time was right, I could choose how and when my identity would be revealed. During this time, David finally got in touch. He called to say Rebecca had mentioned I'd left dinner early and wanted to know if everything was okay. His voice had that tone of superficial concern, as if he were fulfilling an obligation rather than genuinely interested. I told him everything was fine, that I just wasn't feeling well and had decided to go home. He seemed relieved to have an easy excuse and quickly changed the subject to ask if I could babysit Emily this weekend because they had plans. For the first time in years, I said no. David was surprised. He insisted a bit, saying he'd already made plans counting on me. But I stood my ground. I said I had my own commitments and couldn't help. He hung up the phone, clearly frustrated. Rebecca texted me a few days later. A short, direct message asking if I could lend them $5,000 because they'd had some unexpected expenses. She didn't even disguise it as a polite request. It was a demand, with the clear expectation that I would say yes, as I always did. But this time, I replied that I couldn't help at that moment. Her response was immediate and cold. She said she was disappointed in me, that after everything they had done for me, I couldn't do them this small favor. The irony of her words would have been funny if it weren't so sad. As the day of the Foundation's general meeting approached, I mentally prepared myself for what was to come. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself. It was about reclaiming my dignity. It was about showing that I had value, not because of the money I could give, but because I was a person worthy of respect. It was about finally stopping hiding and starting to live authentically. On the day of the meeting, Robert called me in the morning. He was excited, telling me that all the staff were gathered and that he was about to make the big announcement. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat and waited. Rebecca worked at that foundation. She would be at that meeting. And within hours, his perception of who I was would completely change. Later that afternoon, my phone started ringing. It was David. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times in a row. Then the messages started. David said he urgently needed to speak to me. Then it was Rebecca. Her message simply said she needed to see me immediately, that she had something important to discuss. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I knew exactly what had happened, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Not on their terms. This time, it would be on my terms. That evening, Robert called me again. He said the meeting had been an incredible success, that everyone was ecstatic about the donation news. He also mentioned that one of the staff members, Rebecca, had been persistently asking about the donor's identity, sounding particularly anxious. I smiled at this. Robert asked when I wanted my identity revealed. I said not yet, that I would wait a little longer. Over the next few days, the calls and messages from David and Rebecca intensified. They were desperate to talk to me. I finally replied to David with a short message saying I was traveling and that we'd talk when I got back. It was a lie, of course. I was fine in my little house, but I needed time to decide exactly how I wanted the next phase to unfold. A week after the announcement, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Rebecca. She showed up at my door unannounced, with an expression on her face I'd never seen before. A mix of nervousness and something that almost seemed like fear. I let her in and offered her coffee. She declined. We got straight to business. Rebecca began by talking about the donation to the foundation. How incredible it was, how it would change so many lives, how the entire organization was ecstatic. She spoke for several minutes about the impact $10 million would have. Then she stopped and looked at me directly. "Margaret," she said, "I know you have connections with some wealthy people through your volunteer activities. Do you think you could find out who made this donation? The foundation wants to personally thank the donor, and I've been assigned to try to find her." I took a sip of my coffee and thought carefully about my answer. "Why is it so important for you to find out who it is?" I asked. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. She said it was part of her job, that her boss was counting on her. But I could tell there was more to it. She was curious. Desperately curious. And maybe a little scared at the possibility that the donor might be someone she knew. I told Rebecca I didn't know who the donor was, but if I found out anything, I'd let her know. She looked disappointed but thanked me and got up to leave. As she was at the door, she hesitated. "Margaret," she said without looking me in the eye, "I'm sorry if I've been hard on you sometimes. I know you've tried to help in many ways." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest Rebecca had come to admitting any wrongdoing. I just nodded and said goodbye. After she left, I sat back on the couch and thought about what to do next. Part of me wanted to prolong the suspense, make them wait longer, suffer a little in uncertainty. But another part of me, the part that was tired of playing games, wanted to get it over with. I decided it was time for the reveal. I called Robert and told him I was ready to reveal my identity. He suggested doing so at a special donor recognition event the foundation was planning for the following month. But I had a better idea. I wanted the reveal to be more personal, more intimate. I asked Robert to schedule a meeting in his office and invite all senior staff, including Rebecca. He asked if I was sure, and I said yes. He agreed, a little confused but willing to do whatever I asked. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at 3 p.m. Robert sent an email to senior staff saying that the anonymous donor had agreed to reveal herself and wanted to meet the team in person. I imagined Rebecca reading that email, her heart racing, her mind racing, trying to guess who it might be. David called me that evening. He said Rebecca had mentioned the meeting and seemed very anxious about it. He asked again if I knew anything about the donor. I said no and changed the subject. On the morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. I put on a stylish suit I rarely wore, an expensive piece I'd bought years ago but never had the occasion to wear. I styled my hair in a sophisticated style. I wore understated but clearly quality jewelry. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself I'd long hidden. A confident woman. A resourceful woman. A woman who didn't need to diminish herself to make others feel comfortable. I arrived at the foundation's office 15 minutes early. Robert greeted me personally, took me to his office, and offered me tea. We talked briefly about the donation and its impact. Then, at 3 o'clock sharp, he announced it was time. We walked down a hallway to a conference room where I could hear voices on the other side. Robert opened the door, and we entered. The room fell completely silent. About 10 people sat around a large conference table. My eyes immediately fell on Rebecca. She was sitting in the middle of the table, dressed professionally, with a look of eager anticipation on her face. When she saw me enter behind Robert, her expression changed to confusion. She clearly thought I was there for some other reason, perhaps to deliver something or do some volunteer work. Robert walked to the head of the table, and I stood beside him. He began speaking, thanking everyone for coming, explaining the importance of the donation and what it meant for the future of the foundation. Then he said the words I'd been waiting for. "It is with great pleasure and immense gratitude that I introduce to you our generous donor, Margaret Thompson." For a moment, no one moved. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone in the room's eyes were fixed on me, processing what Robert had just said. Then, slowly, people began to stand, applauding politely. I saw Rebecca. She wasn't applauding. She sat completely still, her face blank, her eyes fixed on me with an expression of utter shock. Robert continued, explaining that I had been a quiet supporter of philanthropic causes for many years, that this $10 million donation was just one of many contributions I had made to non-profits. He shared details about my work on the advisory board, about other significant donations I had made over the years. With each word, I saw the shock on Rebecca's face transform into something else. Disbelief. Humiliation. Maybe even a touch of anger. After Robert finished, several people came up to me, thanking me, asking questions about my philanthropic work. I responded graciously, maintaining my composure even when I could feel Rebecca's eyes burning into me from across the room. Finally, after about 20 minutes, the room began to empty. And then there were only 3 people left. Me, Robert, and Rebecca. Rebecca approached slowly. Her face had regained some color, but her eyes were red, as if she were fighting back tears. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I had no idea." I simply stared at her, waiting for her to continue. "Why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think, why did you?" She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. "Because you never asked," I calmly responded. "You made assumptions about who I was based on how I choose to live my life. You judged my worth by the size of my house and the brand of my clothes. And when I offered financial help, you accepted it as if it were my duty, as if it were the only thing of value I had to offer." Rebecca began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the things I said, for the way I treated you. I was horrible. I was cruel. Please forgive me." And for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuine. The arrogant, dismissive woman was gone, replaced by someone who was genuinely mortified by her behavior. But even seeing her tears, even hearing her apology, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. There was no triumph in that moment. Only a deep sadness that things had come to this. That it had taken such a dramatic revelation for her to finally see me as a person worthy of respect. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "your apology means something, but it doesn't erase years of disrespect and humiliation. You treated me like a burden, as if my only value was the money I could give. And even when I gave that money, you saw me as pathetic and needy. You laughed at me in front of your friends. You told me I was broke, that I couldn't even afford groceries. And through it all, my son, my own son, remained silent." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I know," she said between sobs. "I know, and I have no excuse. I was terrible. Please give me a chance to do better. To be better." Robert, who had stood discreetly in the corner of the room, coughed softly. "Margaret, if you need privacy, I can." But I interrupted him. "No, thank you, Robert. I think what needed to be said here has been said." I started to turn to leave when Rebecca spoke again. "What now? What happens now? David will be devastated. Emily needs her grandmother. Please don't cut us out of your life because of my mistakes." I stopped and looked at her. "Rebecca, I won't cut you out of my life. Emily is my granddaughter, and I love her. But things will change. I will no longer accept being treated as less than I am. I will no longer remain silent when I am disrespected. And I will no longer use money as a way to buy my place in the family. From now on, if you want me in your lives, it will be because you value me as a person, not for what I can give financially." I left the conference room and walked through the foundation's hallways. When I reached the parking lot, I finally let my emotions out. I sat in my car and cried. But these tears were different from the ones I'd shed a few weeks earlier. These weren't tears of humiliation or pain. They were tears of liberation. Of finally telling the truth. Of finally standing up for myself. Of finally recognizing my own worth. That night, David showed up at my door. He looked devastated. Rebecca had told him about the meeting, about the revelation. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let things get to this point?" I let him in, and we made coffee. We sat in my small living room and finally had the conversation we should have had years ago. I told David about all the times Rebecca had disrespected me and he had remained silent. About how his lack of defense had hurt as much as her cruel words. About how I had felt smaller and smaller with each passing year. David cried. He said he hadn't realized how bad things were, that he thought it was just normal mother-in-law conflict, that he didn't want to choose sides. "But David," I said, "when you don't choose sides, you are choosing. You were choosing to allow your wife to treat me badly." He admitted he'd been a coward. He said Rebecca could be intimidating, that he was afraid of causing problems in the marriage. But he acknowledged that this was no excuse. That he should have stood up for me. That he should have set boundaries with Rebecca about how she treated me. He apologized repeatedly, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to express his regret. "And Mom," he finally said, "why didn't you ever tell us about the money? Why did you let us think?" He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Why did you let Rebecca think you needed help?" I sighed. "Because your father taught me that money doesn't define who you are. That you don't use wealth to impress or control people. And because, honestly, David, I wanted to see if you would value me without knowing. I wanted to believe our relationship was based on love, not financial self-interest. But it became clear that money was always at the center of everything, whether by its presence or its supposed absence." David was silent for a long moment. Then he asked what was next, if I still wanted to be part of their family. I told him the same thing I'd told Rebecca. That Emily was my granddaughter, and I'd always be there for her. But things needed to change. That I needed respect, not tolerance. That if they wanted me in their lives, it would have to be for the right reasons. He agreed, promised things would be different, that he would be different. In the weeks that followed, the changes were slow but noticeable. Rebecca stopped making disparaging comments about my life or my choices. David began actively defending me when someone spoke disrespectfully about me. They stopped asking for money, and when I offered help, they thanked me genuinely, not with an expectation of entitlement. Small things changed too. Rebecca started asking my opinion on decisions regarding Emily. David called me just to talk, not because he needed anything. But the most significant change happened within myself. I stopped putting myself down. I began living more authentically. Not drastically different. I still valued simplicity and discretion, but now I did it by choice rather than fear of judgment. I also became more open about my philanthropic work, participating in public events, and allowing my name to be recognized when appropriate. About 2 months after the revelation, Rebecca asked me to lunch. We went to a small restaurant near her home. During the meal, she talked about how much she had reflected on her behavior. She admitted that much of her behavior stemmed from insecurity, from feeling like she had to compete with me for David's affection and attention, from fear of not being good enough. She acknowledged that she had projected these insecurities onto me in a cruel and unfair way. I appreciated her honesty. I told her I understood that mother-in-law relationships could be complicated, but that didn't justify cruelty or disrespect. Rebecca agreed. Then she said something that surprised me. "Margaret," she said, "I'd like to start over. Not pretend the past didn't happen, but try to build a real relationship based on mutual respect. Would you be up for that?" I looked at her, this woman who had caused me so much pain, but who now seemed genuinely remorseful and willing to change. "I would be up for it," I replied. The rebuilding process wasn't easy or quick. There were moments of tension, occasions when old patterns threatened to resurface. But now, when that happened, we talked about it. I no longer stayed silent when I felt disrespected. And Rebecca, at least most of the time, took that feedback and tried to improve. David also became better at mediating and setting healthy boundaries. What I learned through this whole experience is that sometimes you have to be willing to completely destroy a toxic dynamic before you can build something healthy in its place. I had spent years trying to keep the peace, trying to be the perfect, submissive mother-in-law, trying to buy love through financial generosity. And all it brought me was pain and a loss of dignity. It was only when I finally established firm boundaries, when I revealed my true identity and worth, that a genuine relationship became possible. Today, my relationship with Rebecca and David is still a work in progress, but it's infinitely better than it was. I see Emily regularly and have a genuine relationship with my granddaughter, unmediated by rigid rules or excessive control. Rebecca and I aren't best friends, and we may never be, but there's mutual respect and genuine consideration. And that's enough. As for money, I continue to do philanthropic work, but now more openly. I serve publicly on the boards of important organizations. I make significant donations and allow my name to be associated with causes that matter to me. Not out of ego or a need for recognition, but because I've realized there's value in being visible, in showing people, especially other older women, that they don't need to hide or dim their light. I also started living a little more. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to visit. I updated a few things in my home, not to impress anyone, but because I deserved to live in a space that brought me joy. I bought a new car, something I'd wanted for years but had always put off. Small indulgences that recognized my own value, not just the value I could provide to others. Looking back now, I don't regret making that $10 million donation. It wasn't really about revenge or teaching Rebecca a lesson, though those elements were certainly present. It was about finally standing up for myself. It was about stopping accepting emotional crumbs while feasting financially. It was about recognizing that I had inherent value that wasn't tied to my money or what I could do for others. And perhaps most importantly, it was about teaching Emily, my granddaughter, a valuable lesson. Even if she's too young to understand it now, one day she will know this story. She will know about the grandmother who stood her ground, who refused to be diminished, who demanded respect. And I hope that when she's older and facing her own challenges, she will remember this story and find the courage to set her own boundaries, to recognize her own worth, to never allow anyone to make her feel less than she is. If you identified with my story, if you've ever felt invisible or undervalued in your family relationships, I want you to know that you're not alone. So many people, especially women, especially mothers and grandmothers, go through similar experiences. We're taught to be peacemakers, to keep the family together at all costs, to silence our own needs in favor of harmony. But sometimes the harmony we maintain is just an illusion, built on our own diminishment. You deserve to be respected. You deserve relationships where your worth is recognized not by what you can offer materially, but by who you are as a person. And if the people in your life can't see that, sometimes you need to do something dramatic to wake them up. Not necessarily something involving $10 million, of course, but something that clearly establishes that you will no longer accept being treated as less than you are. Setting boundaries can be scary, especially with family. There's always the fear that if you stand up for yourself, you'll be cut off, left out, replaced. And yes, sometimes that happens. Some people will choose to walk away from your life rather than treat you with respect. But I've learned that relationships built on submission and silence aren't relationships worth keeping. It's better to be alone with your dignity intact than to be surrounded by people who make you feel small. I also want to speak specifically to the mothers-in-law who may be listening. I know mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationships can be incredibly challenging. There are so many complicated dynamics, so many opportunities for misunderstandings and hurt feelings. But remember, you don't have to accept disrespect in the name of keeping the peace. You don't have to make yourself invisible to make your daughter-in-law feel comfortable. A healthy relationship is one where both people feel valued and respected. And if that's not happening, you have the right to speak up. To the children who may be listening, especially sons caught in the middle of conflicts between wives and mothers, I implore you to find your voice. Your neutrality isn't neutrality. It's a choice. When you stay silent while your wife disrespects your mother, you're telling your mother that she doesn't matter enough to you to defend her. And this causes wounds that can take years to heal, if they heal at all. You can love both your wife and your mother. You can set healthy boundaries that respect both. But you have to be willing to speak up when something is wrong. This story isn't just about me and my family. It's about all of us who have felt invisible, undervalued, taken for granted. It's about reclaiming our voice and our dignity. It's about recognizing that we deserve better and then having the courage to demand better. It won't be easy. There may be consequences. Some people may not like it when you stop being convenient and start being authentic. But in the end, you'll be able to look in the mirror and like the person you see back there. So if you're in a situation where you constantly feel belittled, where your contributions aren't valued, where you're always giving and never receiving respect in return, I encourage you to think about what boundaries you need to set, what truths you need to speak, what changes you need to make. You deserve relationships where you're seen, heard, and valued. And sometimes, to achieve that, you have to be willing to rock the boat, even if it's scary. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you in any way, please leave a like so more people can find it. And in the comments, tell me if you've ever faced a similar situation. How did you deal with it? Let's create a community where we can share our experiences and support each other. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories of overcoming and empowerment. Remember, you are not alone, and your story matters.